What's for dinner, honey? Matthew stepped into the kitchen, his tie loosened and his briefcase placed neatly by the door. He hung his jacket on the chair as he looked at Grace, who was stirring a pot on the stove. She turned and flashed him a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Your favorite, lasagna, she said cheerfully, though her tone seemed forced. Matthew smiled, appreciating the effort. You spoil me. The sound of Ella and Isaac giggling in the living room carried into the kitchen, filling the space with warmth. Matthew glanced toward them and called out, What are you two up to? Ella's voice rang out. Isaac's building a tower, and it's about to fall. No, it's not. Isaac countered, followed by a loud crash and squeals of laughter. Matthew chuckled. Sounds like they're doing some serious engineering in there. Grace nodded but didn't respond, her focus seemingly glued to the pot. Matthew leaned against the counter and watched her for a moment. She looked beautiful as always, but there was something different, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Her phone buzzed on the counter beside her. She glanced at it quickly, tapping the screen to silence it. Matthew caught a glimpse of the name before it disappeared. Richard Donovan. You've been working a lot lately, he said casually, folding his arms. Grace didn't look at him. You know how it is, she said, her voice light but distant. Mr. Donovan is a perfectionist, and I have to stay on top of things. Matthew nodded slowly. Yeah, I get it. You've been putting in a lot of hours. Are you okay? She turned and smiled at him, though it felt rehearsed. Of course. It's just work, Matthew. It's not like I'm out partying. The word stung, though Matthew wasn't sure why. He forced a smile and pushed the thought away. I'm proud of you, you know, for everything you do. I know it's not easy balancing work and home. Grace's expression softened for a moment. Thanks, Matthew. I appreciate that. As they sat down to dinner, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Grace was unusually quiet, eating quickly and glancing at her phone every few minutes. Ella and Isaac filled the silence with stories from their day. Ella talking about her art project and Isaac proudly describing his victory in a game of tag at school. That's great, buddy, Matthew said, ruffling Isaac's hair. Maybe one day you'll be fast enough to outrun me. Isaac grinned. I'm already faster than you. Matthew laughed, but his gaze drifted back to Grace, who was scrolling through her phone under the table. Grace, he said gently, you've barely touched your food. She looked up startled. Oh, I'm just not that hungry. Long day, you know? Matthew nodded, but didn't press the issue. Later that evening, as the kids were getting ready for bed, Matthew found Grace in the bedroom. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in her hand. She quickly set it down when she saw him. Everything okay? He asked, stepping closer. Yeah, she said, standing up and walking past him toward the bathroom. Just tired. Matthew watched her go, a knot forming in his stomach. He had noticed the little changes over the past few weeks, the constant texting, the late nights, the way she had started dressing up more for work. He had tried to dismiss his suspicions, convincing himself that it was all in his head. But now he wasn't so sure. As Matthew lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he replayed the events of the evening in his mind. Grace's distracted behavior, her phone constantly buzzing, the way she avoided eye contact, it all felt wrong. He turned his head to look at her. She was lying on her side, facing away from him, her breathing steady and even. Her phone was on the nightstand, the screen lighting up briefly with a notification. Matthew resisted the urge to pick it up. He didn't want to be that kind of husband, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. The next morning, as Matthew got ready for work, Grace was already dressed and heading out the door. You're leaving early? He asked, buttoning his shirt. Yeah, she said, grabbing her purse. Mr. Donovan needs me to prep for a big meeting. Matthew nodded, watching her leave. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house. He turned to Ella and Isaac, who were sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal. Daddy, why is Mommy always at work? Ella asked, her big eyes looking up at him. Matthew hesitated. Mommy's job is very important, he said, forcing a smile. But she loves you both very much. Ella nodded, satisfied with the answer. But Matthew felt a pang of guilt. He wasn't sure if he believed his own words. As Matthew drove to work, his mind was racing. He hated the doubts creeping into his thoughts, but he couldn't ignore the signs anymore. He decided he needed to talk to Grace, to clear the air and figure out what was going on. That evening, when he got home, Grace was already there, sitting on the couch with her laptop. "Hey," he said, setting his bag down. "Can we talk?" She looked up, her expression guarded. "About what?" Matthew sat down beside her. I don't know, like we're not connecting lately. You've been so busy with work, and I get that, but I miss us." Grace sighed, closing her laptop. "Matthew, I don't have time for this right now. Work is stressful enough without you adding to it." Her words stung, but Matthew kept his voice calm. "I'm not trying to add stress. I just want to understand what's going on." She stood up, running a hand through her hair. "Nothing's going on. I'm just busy. Can't you see that?" Matthew nodded slowly, watching as she walked away. He felt the distance between them growing, and he didn't know how to bridge the gap. That night, as Grace slept beside him, Matthew stared at her, his mind filled with questions he was too afraid to ask. The perfect life they had built together felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to stop it. But deep down, he knew that the illusion of perfection could only last so long. Matthew arrived home earlier than usual, juggling his briefcase and a bag of takeout. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the usual chaos of Ella and Isaac's laughter and Grace's busy movements in the kitchen. He frowned, setting the bags on the counter. "Grace? Kids? Where's everybody?" No response. He checked the living room. Empty. The dining room. Empty. A nervous feeling began to gnaw at him as he climbed the stairs. "Grace?" he called again, his voice echoing down the hallway. As he reached the top, he heard something, muffled voices. A laugh. His steps faltered, and his stomach tightened. The sound was coming from their bedroom. "No, it's nothing," he told himself. "Maybe she's on the phone. Or maybe..." But deep down, he already knew. He pushed open the door, his breath catching in his throat. There they were, Grace and her boss, Richard Donovan, tangled in the sheets of their marital bed. Clothes were scattered on the floor, their intimacy laid bare under the dim glow of the bedside lamp. The room fell silent. Grace froze, her eyes wide with shock, for only a second before her face hardened into something else, defiance. Matthew stood there, unable to move, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear himself think. Richard was the first to break the silence. He didn't flinch or stammer. Instead, he smirked, pulling the covers up over his chest like it was a joke. "Well, this is awkward." Matthew's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He forced himself to focus on Grace. "What is this?" His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "How could you do this to me? To us?" Grace sat up, wrapping the blanket around herself. She didn't look guilty. She didn't look sorry. "What are you doing home so early?" she asked, her tone sharp, like he was the one who had done something wrong. Matthew blinked, incredulous. "What am I doing here? This is my house. My bedroom. And you're doing this?" Grace's eyes narrowed. "I didn't know I needed your permission to live my life." "Live your life." Matthew's voice rose. "You're sleeping with your boss. In our bed. Do you even hear yourself?" Richard, still lounging like he owned the place, chuckled softly. "Relax, buddy. Maybe if you were man enough, she wouldn't need me." Matthew's vision blurred with rage. His fists itched to swing, to wipe the smug grin off Richard's face, but he held himself back. "Get out," Matthew growled, his voice low and dangerous. Richard raised an eyebrow. "What did you say?" "I said, get out of my house." Matthew stepped forward, his entire body trembling with barely contained fury. "Now!" Richard stood, slowly pulling on his shirt, clearly unbothered. He glanced at Grace. "You sure you're going to be okay, babe? I can stay if you want." "I said, get out!" Matthew shouted, his voice echoing through the house. Richard held up his hands mockingly. All right. No need to get violent." He grabbed his shoes and strolled out of the room, pausing in the doorway to throw one last jab over his shoulder. "Good luck, pal. You're going to need it." When Richard was gone, the weight of the situation hit Matthew like a truck. He turned back to Grace, who was now sitting on the edge of the bed, her arms crossed over her chest. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice quieter but no less angry. Grace rolled her eyes. Does it matter? Of course it matters. Matthew snapped. We have a life together. A family. And you do this? Grace stood, letting the blanket drop. She didn't bother covering herself as she reached for her robe. Don't make this bigger than it is, Matthew. It's not like I don't still care about you. Matthew stared at her, his mind reeling. Care about me? You care about me, but you're screwing your boss behind my back. Grace sighed, tying the robe around her waist. Look, it just happened, okay? Richard understands me in ways you don't. He's successful, confident, ambitious. Matthew cut her off, his voice trembling with disbelief. And I'm none of those things, right? That's what you're saying. Grace didn't answer. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, before sitting back down on the bed. This doesn't change anything, she said after a moment, her voice cold and firm. Matthew blinked, sure he had misheard her. What? This doesn't change anything, Grace repeated. We're still a family. You're not leaving. And if you even think about taking the kids, you'll regret it. Matthew felt the ground shift beneath him. Are you threatening me? I'm protecting my children, Grace said. They deserve a stable home, and I won't let you ruin that just because you're upset over a little mistake. Matthew stared at her, his chest heaving. A little mistake? This isn't some misunderstanding, Grace. You betrayed me. You betrayed our family. Grace stood, stepping closer to him. And what are you going to do about it? Run to a lawyer? Drag the kids through a nasty divorce? You think that'll make you the good guy? Matthew couldn't believe what he was hearing. You don't even feel bad, do you? Grace didn't answer. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Matthew shook his head, his voice filled with quiet resolve. You're not the woman I thought you were. Grace laughed bitterly. Maybe you never really knew me. Matthew turned and walked out of the room, his hands shaking. As he reached the front door, he paused, his mind racing. He had no idea what to do, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew the road ahead would be messy, but he also knew he couldn't let her manipulate him anymore. Matthew drove through the quiet streets, the sound of the engine humming in his ears as his mind churned with anger, disbelief, and hurt. The betrayal he had just experienced at home had left him gutted. There was only one place he could think of where he might find some comfort, his mother's house. She had always been his rock, the one person who had stood by him through life's storms. If anyone could help him make sense of what had just happened, it was her. When he pulled into her driveway and cut the engine, he sat in the car for a moment, staring at the small house where he'd spent so much of his life. It was late, but her lights were still on. Taking a deep breath, he got out and made his way to the door. He knocked softly. Moments later, the door opened, and there she was, his mother, a warm smile on her face that faltered when she saw the tension in his eyes. Matthew, what's wrong? She asked, stepping aside to let him in. Matthew walked past her into the living room, collapsing onto the couch. It's Grace, he said, his voice hoarse. She's been cheating on me, with her boss. I caught them tonight in our bed. His mother's eyes widened slightly, but her reaction wasn't what he expected. She didn't gasp in horror or pull him into a comforting hug. Instead, she closed the door and walked calmly into the room, sitting across from him. You're sure about this? She asked, her tone measured. I saw it with my own eyes, Matthew said, running a hand through his hair. There's no misunderstanding here, Mom. She didn't even deny it. She just told me to accept it or leave. His mother sighed, leaning back in her chair. Matthew, listen to me. You need to think carefully about what you're going to do next. What is there to think about? He snapped, his voice rising. She betrayed me. She destroyed our marriage. How am I supposed to just go back and pretend everything's fine? His mother's expression hardened. Because you have a family to think about. Ella and Isaac need their parents together. You can't just throw that away over one mistake. Matthew stared at her, stunned. One mistake? She's been having an affair, Mom. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was calculated, ongoing deceit. And why do you think that happened? She shot back. Do you think Grace woke up one day and decided to do this for no reason? Maybe you should have been paying more attention to her. Maybe she wouldn't have turned to someone else if you were the husband she needed. Her words hit him like a slap in the face. He stood abruptly, pacing the room. Are you seriously blaming me for this? I've worked hard to provide for my family. I've been there for Grace and the kids every step of the way. And now you're telling me this is my fault? Marriage is about more than just paying bills, Matthew, his mother said firmly. It's about keeping your wife happy, emotionally and otherwise. If you failed to notice she was unhappy, then yes, part of the blame is on you. Matthew stopped pacing and turned to face her, his jaw clenched. So what? I'm just supposed to forgive her? Pretend like nothing happened? Is that what you're saying? Yes, she said, her voice steady. If you want to keep your family intact, that's exactly what you need to do. Divorce is ugly, Matthew. It'll tear your kids apart. And if you go down that road, don't expect me to stand by you. Matthew froze, her words sinking in like daggers. What are you talking about? His mother stood, crossing her arms. If you divorce Grace over a tiny affair, you can never call me your mother again. For a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Matthew stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. A tiny affair, he repeated, his voice trembling. Mom, she betrayed me. In my own house. In front of our kids. His mother didn't waver. And I'm telling you, Matthew, that this doesn't have to be the end. People make mistakes. Marriage isn't easy, and sometimes things like this happen. You have to rise above it. Matthew's hands shook as he clenched them into fists. I came here because I thought you'd understand. I thought you'd support me. But instead, you're defending her? You're blaming me? I'm being realistic, she said sharply. You're lucky Grace stayed with you as long as she has. She's beautiful, smart, and successful. Do you really think you could do better? Matthew felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. Do better? This isn't about me trying to do better, Mom. This is about respect. Trust. She destroyed that. And now you're asking me to just ignore it? I'm asking you to be a man, she said, her voice cold. To do what's best for your family. You have children, Matthew. They need their mother and father under the same roof. If you let your pride get in the way, you'll ruin their lives. Matthew sank back onto the couch, his head in his hands. Her words cut deeper than the betrayal itself. He had always thought of his mother as his biggest ally, the one person who would stand by him no matter what. But now, he realized he was utterly alone. I can't believe this, he said quietly. You're supposed to be on my side. I am on your side, she insisted. I'm telling you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. Matthew looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. No, you're taking her side. You're telling me to swallow my dignity and let her get away with this because it's easier for everyone else. But what about me, Mom? What about what this is doing to me? She didn't answer. After a long silence, Matthew stood. I think I've heard enough. His mother's voice followed him as he walked to the door. Don't make a mistake you can't take back, Matthew. Think about your kids. Think about your family. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, turning to look at her one last time. I am thinking about my kids, and I refuse to teach them that this is okay. Without another word, he walked out, the door closing behind him with a hollow thud. As he got into his car and drove away, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The two women he had trusted most in his life, his wife and his mother, had both turned their backs on him. But as painful as it was, he knew one thing for certain. He would not let them break him. Matthew woke early, sunlight filtering through the blinds of a restless night. His mind was clear, the chaos of the previous days distilled into one firm resolution. He couldn't stay. Not in that house, not in that marriage, and certainly not in the toxic environment that was poisoning him and his children. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed picture of his family on the nightstand. Ella and Isaac smiled back at him, their young faces radiating innocence. They didn't deserve this. Matthew knew he had to act fast. Grace and Richard often spent their Saturday morning shopping, another excuse for her to spend time with her lover. He had overheard her mention it on a phone call the night before. By 9 a.m., the house was empty. Matthew heard the garage door close and watched from the window as Grace's car disappeared down the street. The moment it was out of sight, he sprang into action. He grabbed two large suitcases from the closet and began packing clothes, toys, and anything else the kids would need. Ella's favorite stuffed rabbit, Isaac's worn soccer ball. He made sure to pack them all. He paused as he held a framed photo of the family at a beach vacation years ago, back when things felt normal. For a moment, he hesitated, but then he placed it face down on the dresser and continued. Ella and Isaac were still asleep, their small bodies curled up under the covers. Matthew gently woke them. "Dad, what's going on?" Ella asked, rubbing her eyes. "We're going on a little trip, sweetheart," Matthew said softly, brushing her hair back. "Grab a few of your favorite things, okay?" Isaac sat up, yawning. "Where's Mom?" Matthew hesitated, but kept his tone calm. "She'll catch up with us later. Right now, we need to go somewhere safe. Just trust me, okay?" The kids nodded sleepily, too young to grasp the gravity of the situation. As they gathered their things, Matthew scribbled a note and left it on the kitchen counter. "You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. The kids deserve better." He stood for a moment, staring at the words. They felt both final and insufficient. He wanted to say more, to vent his anger, to lay bare the betrayal, but there was no point. Grace had shown him who she was, and he had no intention of giving her a chance to manipulate him any further. Within half an hour, the car was packed. Matthew strapped the kids into the back seat, giving them reassuring smiles as he started the engine. "Where are we going, Dad?" Isaac asked. "Somewhere new," Matthew replied. "It'll be an adventure." They drove in silence for a while, the kids eventually dozing off as the city faded into the distance. Matthew's heart was heavy, but with each mile, the weight lifted ever so slightly. He didn't know exactly where he was headed, but he had a plan, a new beginning far from the betrayal and pain. Hours later, Matthew pulled into the driveway of a small rental house he had quietly secured a few days prior. It wasn't much, a modest two-bedroom in a quiet town, but it was safe. The kids woke as he turned off the engine. "Is this where we're staying?" Ella asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "For now," Matthew said. "What do you think?" Isaac grinned. "It's like a vacation house." Matthew smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Exactly. A little vacation for us." He helped them inside, unpacking the essentials and setting up their rooms. Ella immediately claimed the smaller bedroom, insisting it was cozy, while Isaac busied himself arranging his toys. Matthew sat in the living room once they were settled, the quiet almost deafening. He had done it. He had left. But the reality of what came next loomed over him like a storm cloud. The next morning, Matthew was sipping coffee when his phone buzzed on the table. He tensed, half expecting it to be Grace, but the caller ID showed an unknown number. Hesitantly, he answered. "Mr. Carter?" A voice asked, professional and calm. "Yes, this is Matthew," he replied cautiously. "This is Dr. Bradley from St. Vincent's Hospital. I'm calling regarding Grace Carter. She's been admitted after an accident." Matthew's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of accident?" "She and another individual, Richard Donovan, were involved in a car crash late last night," the doctor explained. "They're both in stable condition, but we thought you should know." Matthew's mind raced. He had imagined many scenarios for Grace and Richard, but this wasn't one of them. "Is she coherent? Can she talk?" he asked. "She's awake but groggy. I can't give you more details over the phone, but if you'd like to come in—" "No," Matthew said sharply, cutting the doctor off. "I'm not coming." The doctor paused, clearly taken aback. "All right. If you change your mind, I won't," Matthew said firmly before hanging up. He sat back, his heart pounding. He didn't feel relief, nor did he feel satisfaction. If anything, he felt nothing. This was just another twist in the mess that Grace had created. Later that day, while the kids played in the backyard, Matthew sat at the dining table, staring at his phone. It buzzed with missed calls and texts from Grace's number, each one more frantic than the last. "Matthew, please. Call me. I need to talk to you. It's important. I'm sorry, okay? Just answer me." He turned the phone over, silencing the notifications. He had nothing to say to her. She had made her bed, quite literally, and now she could deal with the consequences. The only thing that mattered now was Ella and Isaac. By evening, as Matthew tucked the kids into bed, Ella looked up at him with wide eyes. "Dad, is Mom going to come here soon?" she asked softly. Matthew paused, his chest tightening. He knelt beside her bed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Mom's taking some time to figure things out," he said carefully. "But you and Isaac are safe, and that's what's important." Ella seemed to accept this, though a small frown tugged at her lips. "I miss her." Matthew swallowed hard. "I know, sweetheart, but I'm here. Always." As he kissed her forehead and turned off the light, Matthew felt the full weight of his decision settle over him. He had made the right choice, for himself and for his kids. Grace could beg. She could apologize. She could try to manipulate him like she always did. But he was done. This was the start of a new chapter, one where he called the shots. And no matter what happened next, he wouldn't look back. Matthew had initially decided against visiting the hospital. After all, what did he owe Grace or Richard? They had betrayed him in the worst way possible. But as the day wore on and the weight of the situation sank in, he reconsidered. This wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about closure. He needed to face them one last time to let them know exactly where things stood. When he arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of disinfectant and the quiet hum of machines greeted him. He checked in at the front desk and was directed to the shared room where Grace and Richard were recovering. Pushing open the door, Matthew was struck by the sight before him. Grace lay in one bed, her face pale and her arm in a cast. Her eyes were swollen, as if she had been crying for hours. In the bed beside her was Richard, his head bandaged and his leg suspended in a cast. Despite their injuries, the tension in the room was palpable. Grace's head turned sharply when she saw Matthew enter. Her eyes filled with fresh tears, and she immediately reached out toward him. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You came. I didn't think you would." Matthew stepped further into the room, his expression cold and unreadable. "I wasn't planning to," he said evenly, "but I needed to see this for myself, to remind myself why I made the choices I did." Grace's tears began to flow freely. "Matthew, please. I was wrong. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I don't know what I was thinking. I need you. I need my family back." Matthew stared at her, his jaw tightening. "You're only saying that now because you're lying here broken. If this hadn't happened, you'd still be out there with him, wouldn't you?" He gestured toward Richard without sparing him a glance. Grace shook her head desperately. "No, that's not true. I was confused, lost, but I see things clearly now. I love you, Matthew. Please believe me." A bitter laugh escaped Matthew's lips. "You love me? Is that what you were thinking when you brought him into our bed? When you told me to accept it or leave? That doesn't sound like love to me, Grace. That sounds like contempt." Richard, who had been silent until now, let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, come on, buddy. Don't let her fool you. She'll come back to me the moment she's out of here. This whole apology act? It's just because she knows she can't manage on her own." Grace shot him a furious glare. "Shut up, Richard. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I?" Richard smirked, wincing slightly as he shifted in the bed. "Face it, Grace. You didn't cheat on him because you were confused. You cheated because you wanted something better. And let's not pretend you're not already thinking about how to spin this to get back into his good graces while keeping me on the side." Matthew turned his gaze to Richard, his expression icy. "You're really one to talk about better, aren't you? Lying there, depending on nurses to feed you, and probably drowning in lawsuits because you can't keep your personal life out of your professional one." Richard's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "At least I don't live in denial. You're here because you still care. You're here because deep down you want her back." Matthew stepped closer to Grace's bed, ignoring Richard's taunts. His voice dropped, firm but calm. "You don't get to rewrite history, Grace. You made your choice. You looked me in the eye and told me you didn't owe me an apology, that I could either accept your affair or leave. Well, I made my choice too." Grace sobbed harder, clutching the edge of her blanket. "I was wrong, Matthew. I see that now. I didn't mean it. I was scared, angry, and I lashed out. Please don't do this. Don't throw away everything we've built together." Matthew let out a slow, measured breath. "You threw it away, Grace. The moment you brought him into our lives, you destroyed everything we had. And now you want me to clean up the mess for you? To pretend none of it happened for the sake of some warped version of normal? No, I won't do it. Richard laughed again, though it was weaker this time. Tough talk, but let's be real. You're not going to find anyone better. Not with the baggage you're carrying. Matthew turned to him, his voice steady but laced with quiet fury. You know, Richard, for someone who prides himself on being better, you're in an awfully pathetic position right now. Let me be clear. I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to make sure neither of you ever gets near my kids again. Richard scoffed. Good luck with that. Courts don't take kindly to dads running off with their kids, no matter how noble they think they are. Matthew's lips curved into a cold smile. Funny you mention courts. I've already spoken to a lawyer. And once your company gets wind of the misconduct you've been up to, I doubt you'll have the resources to fight me. Richard's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of unease. Grace reached out again, her voice breaking. Matthew, please. Don't do this. I'll do anything to make it right. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. Just don't take the kids away from me. Matthew took a step back, his expression softening for the first time, but not with pity. It was resolve. Ella and Isaac deserve better than this. Better than lies, betrayal, and manipulation. I'm not taking them away to hurt you, Grace. I'm doing it to protect them. Grace broke into a fresh wave of sobs, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. Matthew stood there for a moment, watching the two people who had caused him so much pain. He had expected to feel satisfaction, maybe even vindication, but all he felt was a quiet sense of finality. He turned to leave, his voice steady as he spoke his final words. Get well, Grace, and stay away from my family. As he walked out of the room, the sound of Grace's cries and Richard's muttered curses faded behind him. Matthew didn't look back. He stepped into the hospital corridor, the cold fluorescent lights overhead a stark contrast to the emotional storm he had just endured. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. This was the end of one chapter and the start of another, one where he would rebuild his life on his own terms, with no room for betrayal, lies, or toxic people. Matthew sat at his kitchen table, the dim glow of his laptop illuminating his face. The children were asleep in the next room, safe and sound in the small apartment he had rented after leaving the house. The world around him was quiet, but his mind was anything but. Revenge wasn't something he had ever sought before, but this wasn't about petty payback. This was about justice for himself, for his children, and for the betrayal that had shattered his life. Matthew opened his email and typed a carefully worded letter. Attached to it were screenshots of texts between Grace and Richard that he had retrieved from her phone before he left. The messages were damning, explicit details of their affair, references to work-related conversations that bled into their personal lives, and hints of favoritism that could easily raise ethical concerns. The email was addressed to the HR department of Richard's company. Before hitting send, Matthew leaned back in his chair, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wasn't a cruel man by nature, but Richard had flaunted his power and influence, using it to manipulate Grace and belittle Matthew. It was time someone reminded him that actions have consequences. With a deep breath, he pressed send. The next morning, Matthew called his lawyer. I want to move forward with filing for full custody of my kids, he said firmly. The lawyer, an older man with years of experience in family law, listened patiently as Matthew explained the situation. Infidelity alone won't help you win custody, the lawyer warned. But if you can prove that your wife's actions have negatively impacted the children, you'll have a strong case. Do you have any evidence? Matthew nodded, though the lawyer couldn't see him over the phone. I've been documenting everything. The late nights, the neglect, the affair, and even the fact that she threatened to keep the kids from me unless I accepted her infidelity. Good, the lawyer said. This won't be easy, but it sounds like you're prepared. We'll need to act quickly. As the legal proceedings began, Matthew threw himself into rebuilding his life. He started hitting the gym, not out of vanity, but to channel his frustration into something productive. He also focused on his job, pouring his energy into his work and earning a promotion within months. It was during one of these work days that he met Claire. Claire was nothing like Grace. She was a freelance graphic designer who often worked in the same co-working space as Matthew. They struck up a conversation one day over coffee, and what started as casual small talk turned into longer, meaningful discussions. One afternoon, as they sat together during a break, Claire asked him, "You seem like someone who's been through a lot. What's your story?" Matthew hesitated. It wasn't an easy story to share, but something about Claire's genuine curiosity and kind eyes made him open up. He told her everything: the affair, the betrayal, the custody battle, and his plans to ensure his kids had a better life. Claire listened intently, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. "You've been through hell," she said softly when he finished. "But you're doing everything you can to rise above it. That says a lot about the kind of person you are." Her words stuck with Matthew. For the first time in months, he felt like someone truly saw him, not as a victim, but as a survivor. Meanwhile, back in Grace and Richard's world, things were falling apart. Matthew's email to HR had triggered an internal investigation. Richard was suspended pending further review, and whispers of the affair spread like wildfire through the office. Grace, who had already been on thin ice due to her erratic behavior, was also under scrutiny. One evening, Grace called Matthew. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice frantic. "Richard's been suspended, and I'm being questioned at work. They're saying someone sent proof of what happened." Matthew's voice was calm, but firm. "I didn't do anything that you didn't bring on yourself, Grace. You made your choices, and now you're facing the consequences." "You're trying to ruin me," she cried. "No," Matthew said sharply. "You ruined yourself. All I did was make sure people saw the truth. You don't get to play the victim here." The call ended with Grace sobbing, but Matthew didn't feel a shred of sympathy. This was the bed she had made, and now she had to lie in it. A few weeks later, the custody hearing took place. Matthew arrived at the courthouse dressed in a sharp suit, his lawyer by his side. Grace was there too, looking disheveled and stressed. She had tried to present herself as the doting mother, but Matthew's lawyer dismantled her facade piece by piece. They presented evidence of her neglect, including witness testimonies from neighbors who had noticed the kids being left alone while Grace was out late. They also played a recording of her threatening Matthew, which he had secretly made during one of their arguments. By the time the hearing ended, it was clear which direction the judge was leaning. Matthew was awarded full custody, with Grace granted supervised visitation rights. As they left the courthouse, Grace approached Matthew, her eyes red from crying. "Please, Matthew," she begged, "don't take them away from me. I know I made mistakes, but I love our kids. I'll do anything to make this right." Matthew looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You had every chance to do right by them, Grace. But you didn't. This isn't about punishing you. It's about giving Ella and Isaac the stability they deserve." Grace broke down, but Matthew walked away, his resolve unwavering. Life gradually began to settle into a new normal for Matthew. He and Claire grew closer, and she became a positive presence in his children's lives. They spent weekends at the park, movie nights at home, and quiet evenings filled with laughter, things Matthew hadn't experienced in years. One evening, as Matthew and Claire sat on the couch after the kids had gone to bed, she turned to him and said, "You're an incredible father, Matthew. I hope you know that." Matthew smiled, a genuine smile that he hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm just trying to do my best." Claire reached for his hand. "And you're doing an amazing job. You deserve to be happy." For the first time in what felt like forever, Matthew believed it. Meanwhile, Grace and Richard's lives continued to unravel. Richard was fired after the investigation concluded, and Grace eventually lost her job as well. Their relationship, built on lies and deceit, crumbled under the pressure. Grace moved into a small apartment, struggling to make ends meet, while Richard disappeared from her life entirely. Matthew heard about their downfall through mutual acquaintances, but he didn't dwell on it. His focus was on the future, one that he was determined to build with honesty, love, and the people who truly mattered. And as he sat at the dinner table one evening, laughing with his kids and Claire, he realized he had found something far more valuable than revenge: peace. Grace sat on the worn-out couch of her tiny apartment, staring at the eviction notice crumpled in her trembling hands. The walls of the place were thin, and the muffled sounds of her neighbors arguing next door only added to the suffocating reality of her situation. A far cry from the spacious, comfortable home she once shared with Matthew and the kids. Her new life was a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. The knock at the door startled her. She quickly shoved the notice into a drawer and rushed to answer. Opening the door, she found Richard standing there, looking disheveled. His once pristine suits and arrogant demeanor had been replaced by a shabby jacket and an air of irritation. "You're late with the rent again, Grace," he said, his voice devoid of the charm he once wielded so easily. Grace crossed her arms, trying to maintain some dignity. "I told you, I'm waiting on a check from the temp agency. It'll come through soon." Richard rolled his eyes. "Spare me the excuses. You're lucky I even let you crash here after everything blew up." "You let me crash here?" Grace snapped, her voice rising. "You're the one who begged me to come with you after Matthew left." Richard smirked bitterly. "Yo, that was before your drama got me fired. Do you have any idea how hard it is to find work when your name's dragged through the mud? You ruined my reputation." Grace laughed humorlessly. "Oh, don't play the victim, Richard. You were the one who wanted me to leave Matthew. You promised we'd have a better life together, remember? Now look at us." Richard stepped closer, his voice cold. "Look, I'm done with your sob stories. If you can't pay your share of the rent by next week, you're out." He stormed out before Grace could respond, slamming the door behind him. She sank onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. Later that evening, Grace picked up her phone and hesitated before dialing Matthew's number. It had been weeks since their last conversation, but she was desperate. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Grace," Matthew said, his tone flat. "What do you want?" "Matthew, please, just hear me out," she began, her voice cracking. I need help. Things have been so hard since you left. Richard, he's not who I thought he was. I made a mistake. I see that now." Matthew's silence on the other end was deafening. When he finally spoke, his words were sharp. "A mistake? You call tearing our family apart a mistake? You didn't just hurt me, Grace. You hurt Ella and Isaac. You turned our home into a battlefield." "I know," Grace sobbed. "I know I was wrong, but I'm trying to make things right. Can't we try again? For the kids?" Matthew's laugh was cold and humorless. "For the kids? Don't bring them into this. You didn't think about them when you invited Richard into our bedroom. They're happy now, Grace. They're safe, and I'm not going to let you drag them back into your mess." Grace's voice grew desperate. "Matthew, I'm begging you. Please. I can't do this alone." "You should have thought of that before," Matthew said, his voice icy. "You made your bed, Grace. Now lie in it." The line went dead. Days turned into weeks, and Grace's situation only worsened. She managed to scrape together enough to avoid eviction, but Richard eventually made good on his threat and threw her out. Homeless and jobless, Grace found herself living in a shelter, surrounded by strangers who had also hit rock bottom. One evening, while sitting in the shelter's communal area, she overheard two women talking about their kids. The pang of longing in her chest was unbearable. She hadn't seen Ella or Isaac since the custody hearing, and her supervised visitation rights were nothing more than a cruel joke. Determined to see her children, Grace decided to visit Matthew's apartment unannounced. She waited outside the building, watching as he walked Ella and Isaac to the nearby park. The kids looked happy, laughing and holding hands with their father. Grace stepped forward hesitantly. "Matthew," she called out. Matthew turned, his expression hardening as soon as he saw her. He placed a protective hand on Isaac's shoulder. "What are you doing here, Grace?" Ella hid behind her father, her small hands clutching his shirt. Grace's heart broke at the sight. I wanted to see them," Grace said, her voice trembling. "Please, Matthew, just for a few minutes." Matthew shook his head. "You lost that right when you put them last, Grace. They don't need this chaos in their lives." Tears streamed down Grace's face as she dropped to her knees. "I'm sorry, Matthew. I was selfish. I was stupid. I'll do anything to make it up to you. Please, don't shut me out." Ella peeked out from behind Matthew and whispered, "Daddy, who is she?" The question hit Grace like a punch to the gut. Matthew knelt down to Ella's level and spoke softly. "She's someone who made some bad choices, sweetheart. But it's okay. We're safe now." He stood and looked back at Grace. "This is what you've done, Grace. You've become a stranger to them. I gave you so many chances, but you threw them all away." Before Grace could respond, Matthew turned and walked away with the kids. She watched them go, her sobs echoing in the quiet street. Meanwhile, Matthew's life continued to flourish. His relationship with Claire grew stronger, and she became a loving presence in Ella and Isaac's lives. One evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, Claire turned to Matthew and said, "You've built something beautiful here, Matthew. I'm honored to be a part of it." Matthew smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't known in years. "We've built it together, Claire. Thank you for standing by me." In the months that followed, Grace's attempts to reconcile with Matthew dwindled. She found a job at a small diner, barely making enough to survive. Richard had vanished entirely, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Every day was a reminder of what she had lost, and every night she dreamed of the life she had destroyed. Matthew, on the other hand, had moved on, not just from Grace, but from the pain she had caused. He had rebuilt his life piece by piece, creating a home filled with love and laughter. And while Grace languished in regret, Matthew finally found the peace and happiness he had been searching for all along. The morning sunlight streamed through the large bay windows of Matthew's new home, painting the living room in hues of gold. Claire stood in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The smell of fresh coffee and pancakes wafted through the air. Ella and Isaac sat at the dining table, giggling as they scribbled on sheets of paper, their crayons scattered in a colorful mess. Matthew walked in, a warm smile on his face as he took in the scene. For the first time in years, his home felt peaceful. "What's so funny over there?" Matthew asked, ruffling Isaac's hair. Isaac grinned, holding up his drawing of a stick figure family. "It's us. See? That's you, me, Ella, and Claire. And look, we have a dog now." Matthew chuckled, crouching down to examine the drawing. "Well, buddy, I guess that means we'll have to start thinking about getting a dog, huh?" Claire leaned over from the kitchen, a playful smile on her lips. "Don't make promises you're not ready to keep, Matthew. Dogs are a lot of work." Ella piped up, her face lighting up with excitement. "Please, Daddy. I promise I'll help take care of it." Matthew laughed, raising his hands in mock surrender. All right. Let's take it one step at a time." As they sat down for breakfast, Matthew couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy, but it was worth every step. Claire glanced at him from across the table, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "What's on your mind?" she asked softly. Matthew took a sip of his coffee before responding. "Just how far we've come. It feels good to finally have a home filled with love and laughter again." Claire reached out and took his hand. "You deserve this, Matthew. You've been through so much, but look at what you've built. It's beautiful." Meanwhile, across town, Grace's life was an unending struggle. She sat in the cramped back office of the diner where she worked, her uniform stained from the day's shift. The manager had just handed her her paycheck, which was barely enough to cover her rent. She opened the envelope and sighed. "Barely enough for groceries," she muttered to herself. As she walked out of the diner, the cold wind bit at her face. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, her mind drifting back to the life she had once taken for granted. The memories of the house she had shared with Matthew and the kids haunted her. The laughter, the warmth, the stability, it was all gone now, replaced by loneliness and regret. One evening, as Grace sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, she scrolled through her phone. She hadn't spoken to Matthew in months, and the weight of her mistakes felt heavier with each passing day. Unable to resist, she opened social media and searched for him. Her heart ached as she saw a picture of Matthew and Claire with Ella and Isaac, all smiling brightly at what looked like a park picnic. The caption read, "Family Day at the Park." Feeling grateful for every moment, tears streamed down her face as she stared at the photo. "I had all of that," she whispered to herself, "and I threw it away." The sound of her phone ringing snapped her out of her thoughts. It was Richard. She hesitated before answering. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tired. Richard's tone was sharp. "You still owe me for last month's rent. If you don't have it by the end of the week, don't bother coming back." Grace clenched her fists. "I don't have it right now, Richard. Can't you give me a little more time?" "I've already given you enough time," he snapped. Figure it out, Grace. It's not my problem anymore. The line went dead, and Grace threw the phone onto the couch in frustration. She buried her face in her hands, the weight of her choices crushing her. Back in Matthew's world, life was blossoming. He had recently taken on a new role at work, one that allowed him to spend more time with his children. Claire had become a central part of their lives, not as a replacement for their mother, but as a loving presence who understood the delicate balance of stepping into a blended family. One evening, Matthew and Claire sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed. The stars twinkled overhead, and the cool breeze carried the sound of crickets chirping in the distance. "You've created something amazing here, Matthew," Claire said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Matthew smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've been my rock, Claire. After everything that happened, I didn't think I could trust anyone again. But you proved me wrong." Claire turned to face him, her eyes serious. "I didn't do anything special. You just needed someone to remind you that you deserve happiness. And now look at you. You're an incredible father and a wonderful man." Matthew kissed her forehead, his heart full. "Thank you, Claire, for everything." Months later, Matthew stood in the audience at Ella's school recital, holding Claire's hand as Isaac sat beside them. Ella took the stage, her face beaming with confidence as she performed her part. Matthew felt a swell of pride, knowing that he had given his children the stability and love they deserved. After the recital, as they walked back to the car, Ella grabbed Matthew's hand. "Did I do okay, Daddy?" Matthew smiled down at her. "You were amazing, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Claire chimed in. "You were the star of the show, Ella." Ella giggled, skipping ahead with Isaac as the two raced to the car. Matthew turned to Claire, his voice filled with gratitude. "This is what I've always wanted. A family, a fresh start, and peace." Claire nodded, her eyes shining. "You've earned it, Matthew. You've turned the page, and now you're writing a beautiful new chapter." As they drove home, Matthew felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined him. He had rebuilt his life from the ground up, and for the first time in years, he felt truly free. Back in her dingy apartment, Grace stared at her empty walls, consumed by regret. Her choices had left her with nothing but memories of a life she could never get back. Meanwhile, Matthew looked to the future, his heart full of hope and his family by his side. "Life goes on," he whispered to himself that night, holding Claire's hand as they sat on the couch. "And I'm finally free.